Muy buenas tardes, tengan todos ustedes, sean bienvenidos a este evento organizado por el Aspen Institute en el contexto de la reunión que sostiene en nuestro país su comité internacional. Este evento ha sido coauspiciado por la Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México y de manera particular por su rector, el doctor Enrique Graue, a quien le agradezco todo el apoyo como miembro también de nuestro consejo y al que le agradezco particularmente su presencia esta tarde. Muchas gracias, señor rector. También ha coauspiciado esta reunión el gobierno de la ciudad. Quiero expresar públicamente mi gratitud al jefe de gobierno, al doctor Miguel Ángel Mancera, y a quien hoy lo representa, un universitario querido y distinguido, el jefe de la Oficina de Asuntos Internacionales del Gobierno de la Ciudad, el ingeniero Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas. Muchas gracias, ingeniero. También agradezco de manera señalada la presencia del secretario de Turismo, el licenciado Enrique de la Madrid Cordero. Bienvenido, señor secretario. Quiero dar la bienvenida a los miembros del Comité Internacional del Aspen Institute, en particular a su presidenta, la señora Claire Muñana, y al vicepresidente ejecutivo de Aspen, nuestro buen amigo Elliot Gerson. Bienvenidos. Junto con los presidentes o representantes de los institutos Aspen en España, en Francia, en Japón, en la India, en Ucrania, en la República Checa, en los Estados Unidos y como una invitada muy especial del Reino Unido que próximamente iniciará también con actividades de un instituto Aspen. Dar la bienvenida también a los miembros de nuestro consejo, a los integrantes del cuerpo diplomático, académicos, estudiantes y todos ustedes que nos acompañan. Permítaseme unas cuantas palabras introductorias en español para mencionar algunos aspectos relevantes del Aspen Institute para aquellos que no lo tienen todavía suficientemente ubicado. El Aspen Institute es un espacio de encuentro, es un espacio de reflexión y de convergencia, donde también se generan proyectos que tienen como objetivo analizar y enfrentar los diversos temas que nos preocupan a todos como sociedad. Como institución educativa, apartidista y plural, el Aspen Institute está particularmente comprometido con valores y principios, con aquellos valores que nos permiten, entre todos, construir una mejor sociedad, ni más ni menos. En ese contexto, el Aspen da la bienvenida a la diversidad, a la cooperación y a la colaboración. Ahora vamos a dar inicio al diálogo que nos convoca este mediodía. De ahora en adelante, la sesión será en inglés, por lo que aquellos que requieran de traducción simultánea, les solicitamos tengan a mano los equipos correspondientes. También les informo que las edecanes estarán repartiendo papeletas para aquellos que quieran hacer alguna pregunta, ya que nuestros invitados amablemente han aceptado contestar preguntas que me harán llegar a través de las edecanes y yo a su vez, en función del tiempo disponible, se las haré a nuestros distinguidos panelistas. It is my pleasure now to introduce and welcome Madam Secretary Madeleine Albright. Madeleine Albright was born in Czechoslovakia. Her family was exiled not once, but twice from their native land. First by the Nazis, then by the communists. So Madeleine became a refugee in the United States.
A partir de esa situación, se convirtió en la primera mujer en servir, en fungir como secretaria de Estado, como secretaria de Relaciones Exteriores del Departamento de Estado de Estados Unidos. También trabajó con el presidente Clinton como embajadora de Estados Unidos en Naciones Unidas. Actualmente es catedrática en la Universidad de Georgetown, una intelectual y también presidenta del Instituto Nacional Democrático y del grupo Albright, que es una firma de diplomacia. Madeleine también ha sido una autora prolífica con libros vendidos en la lista de bestsellers y también está en el consejo del Instituto Aspen y es una muy buena amiga de México. Es una figura bastante respetada en todo el mundo. Bienvenida a México, Madeleine. Asimismo, es un placer presentarles a todos ustedes al secretario de Relaciones Exteriores de México bajo la administración del presidente Miguel de la Madrid, el embajador de México en Washington también, y así como también en Londres, fue juez y vicepresidente de la Corte Internacional de Justicia hasta muy recientemente.
Thankfully, we have him back.
Y estamos tan agradecidos de que ya haya regresado. Es catedrático de Derecho Internacional en el Colegio de México. Y también trabaja como fellow de investigación en la Universidad Nacional
Bernardo
Autónoma de
Sepúlveda
México.
is
Bernardo
undoubtedly one of the most
Sepúlveda es
prestigious diplomats
uno
of
de
Mexico,
los diplomáticos
with
más
an
prestigiados de
international,
México, con
well-deserved reputation.
una reputación
He was
internacional
co-recipient
muy merecida.
of
Fue
the Príncipe de Asturias
recipiente
Award
del premio
for his
Príncipe de Asturias por sus
to
contribuciones
peace
a
and
la
peace.
paz y a la
Welcome,
diplomacia.
Bernardo.
Bienvenido,
It's a pleasure,
Bernardo. Es un
Bernardo.
gran placer tenerte aquí.
I try to cover several points, and I will only make a few interventions in order to be sure that we cover within the given time the topics that we have agreed to discuss. Let me start by asking both of you, from your own experience, what are the perspectives of our complex binational relationship? Madeleine, you have the floor.
Well, thank you, and I'm delighted to be here. Thank you all very much. As far as I'm concerned, the crucial relationship that exists is between the United States and Mexico. We are neighbors. There are so many different aspects of our relationship. It covers everything in terms of both domestic issues in both our countries, national security issues, international issues of every kind. And so I think it is one of the most interesting but also complicated relationships because our societies are affected by all the subjects. And so what I found interesting when I was in office was that every cabinet member was involved in the binationals that we had because they were both domestic and foreign policy issues. I think we are as close to each other and as integrated as any two countries in the world. But it is not without its complications, as we read about in the papers every day. And I think that it is a time where it is very important to have these kinds of discussions because not everything is government to government. Societies are involved in it, businesses are involved in it. Being in an academic setting, our students are very much involved in the relationship. So I do think, as we talk now, I think we need to really be sure to cover all the issues, the domestic and foreign, and those that affect every aspect of our societies.
Thank you, Madeleine.
Yeah.
Is it? Okay, thank you. Let me say, first of all, how pleased I am to be here with you. It's really a privilege, it's an honor, and I'm sure that we shall have a very productive and fruitful dialogue with our own perspectives of the relationship between Mexico and the US. I would also wish to thank Juan Ramón de la Fuente for inviting us to this conversation, which in these present times becomes particularly relevant. You are absolutely right in saying that the importance of the relationship between the two countries is very high indeed. Some speak of a special relationship between the two countries, and I don't think that's really the applicable term. You really have a special relationship, or used to have at least, with the UK. Let's see how things develop now that Brexit is beginning to become a reality. But what I would say, Madeleine, is that perhaps the 30s of the last century were the ones that provided us with a better perspective of the sort of collaboration the two countries should follow. By that I mean the extraordinary presence of Franklin Delano Roosevelt as a guiding statesman in establishing the so-called good neighbor policy. I think that he was someone who provided a new direction in the relationship between Mexico and the US, and by the way, also vis-à-vis Latin America. We were also fortunate in having an extraordinary statesman who was Lázaro Cárdenas. And I want to point out this because in 1938, when Mexico expropriated its oil or the enterprises in the oil business, the reaction of President Roosevelt was extraordinary. He was not hostile to that measure. On the contrary, together with his ambassador, Joseph Daniels, who had been his boss, by the way, as Secretary of the Navy, the two of them made a tremendous contribution to reaching an understanding between the two countries. It was a difficult time, no doubt about that, but the two of them, by that I mean President Lázaro Cárdenas and President Roosevelt, managed to reach an understanding, a friendly understanding. That was not the case with the UK. In the case of the UK, it became far more bitter, and we broke diplomatic relations with London. But I want to mention this because probably that was the turning point of a larger set of issues that provided collaboration between the two countries. From there on, I think that we got a better understanding of the need by the two countries to have reciprocal understandings on the basic issues before us. But also there was a good understanding that diplomacy was the best instrument to solve problems. The approach was a different one. The approach was one of solving problems and not just setting them aside, which was, of course, a very wrong way of conducting international relations. So from there on, Madeleine, I think that we did rather well. In a historical perspective, that was the beginning of that interesting relationship. which meant also building institutions. And by building institutions, I mean, for example, the collaboration that was needed to create the Organization of American States in '48. By that I mean something that has not been sufficiently examined, but which was called the Bracero Program, which was perhaps the first opportunity to come into an agreement on issues related to migration. Unfortunately, because of the differences between supply and demand, the Bracero program had to be terminated in the 50s. But then came the creation of the Inter-American Bank, which has provided an important assistance in the financial development of Latin America as a whole, and of course of Mexico itself. Then we have NAFTA. I hope we still have NAFTA by the time I finish my brief intervention. But that meant that from '94 onwards, there was a systemic institution for a systemic collaboration together with Canada. So in the perspective you have already provided us with, I think that what we must do is to continue to build institutions, to build friendship, to build collaboration, without ignoring the problems that as neighbors we shall have. It's a fact of life, but the approach must be one of solving disputes.
I fully agree, Bernardo, that there are always issues between friends, family, that need to be discussed, and diplomacy is the best way to do it. And especially the closer you are, in many ways, the more issues there really are. I am very proud to have worked for two presidents who understood the relationships, President Carter and President Clinton, and really wanted to solve the problems and be honest with each other. I also am very proud. I did have a role in working on the NAFTA because initially I was in New York, and we kind of developed a mini NAFTA among the ambassadors from the countries, and then foreign secretaries later with Rosario, and then Lloyd Axworthy and I. We did a lot of things together and began to see what the common lines were among the three countries. And I really do think that understanding and I'm very glad you went through all that history, because it's a complicated history, and it does require a president that wants to see both the positive and be able to deal with the negative. I think NAFTA was a very important agreement, and I do think that it was interesting to work on it in terms of trying to get Congress to, you can't have a treaty of that size without having congressional interaction. In the United States, they are absolutely essential in making the rules about, and then doing the implementing legislation afterwards. I think like any agreement or treaty, it does need rejuvenation in a number of different ways, and I think that people that understand it are prepared to do it. Calling it a terrible agreement is not useful. And I do think, since you and I talked yesterday, the situation on NAFTA has changed a little bit, where after what were clearly important telephone calls from your president and the Prime Minister of Canada, there really has been some adjustment by President Trump in terms of what he wants to do. But I think if we can look at issues, understand that they're difficult, but that they have to be discussed, then I think that we are on the right track. I think the immigration issues are complex, there's no question. I was very glad that you made clear, I'm an immigrant, and I have depended on America being fair and open. By the way, I love to give naturalization certificates to people, and I do that. I can't swear people in because I'm not an officer of the law, but I give people their naturalization certificate, and all of a sudden I heard this man say, can you believe that I, as a refugee, got my naturalization certificate from the Secretary of State? And I said, can you believe that a refugee is Secretary of State? And so that made me very proud of what America was doing. I think at this stage we need to really look very carefully at our immigration policy. I think there needs to be a new comprehensive immigration policy, and not the kinds of things that are going on now, where people don't trust each other, where people are afraid, where families are divided. And so I do hope that the Trump administration with Congress is going to take a more kind of substantive and important decision in terms of how this is done, with some humanitarian feelings about the fact that there are real people on either end of these discussions. So.
Very much so, Madeleine. Regarding NAFTA, you mentioned Congress, and Congress will be essential in the development of a modernizing treaty that may fulfill the contemporary needs of trade. I mean, it's 20 years old already, perhaps a bit more, and there is a need to look at the developments that have taken place on trade issues, on investment, and on many other aspects. In that respect, Madeleine, I think that we should take a careful look at what happened with the TTP, the Trans-Pacific Treaty, because in that treaty we have 12 actors, 12 important actors, including 3 that are parties to NAFTA. Now, the TPP meant a 5-year effort to include a number of clauses that are extremely important and that perhaps can be incorporated in this process of modernization of NAFTA into NAFTA itself. It's clear that both the US, Canada, and Mexico came into an agreement in the context of the TPP. Now, many of the topics that are included in that legal instrument could be used to modernize NAFTA. Perhaps we can examine NAFTA with a wider perspective, but what I would say is that there is a very clear need to make sure that Canada, Mexico, and the US negotiate a new treaty. It cannot be a bilateral issue. It has to be a trilateral negotiation in which the 3 parties who are interested parties negotiate among themselves this process of modernization. Now, I wouldn't want to go now into the issues of migration. I will have a few points to make in that respect, but perhaps you can react to this idea of how are we to make sure that NAFTA becomes a useful instrument for the 3 countries. Now, you mentioned Congress. It plays an essential role, but perhaps also other members of the American community, and by that I mean the agricultural sector, the industries, the manufacturing industries, which would be very much affected in a negative way if NAFTA just disappears as a legal instrument between the 3 countries. At some point in time, it was said that something like 57,000 enterprises in the US have 5 million workers that will be affected by the withdrawal of the US from NAFTA. And that would be terrible. So my impression, Madeleine, is that yesterday, when the rumor came about that NAFTA was no longer of interest to the Trump administration, my impression is that there was a very strong reaction on the part of Congress, on the part of the Senate, and on the part of interested parties, industry, agriculture, saying, don't do that mistake. Don't issue an executive order indicating that the US is withdrawing from NAFTA. Yeah. So, an additional point to what you have said is that the US institutions that have a process of checks and balances are working, and are working very well, and we can come back to that issue later on.
Well, let me just say, I think it's important to put all these into a context of what is happening in our countries and internationally. The politics of trade is very sensitive in many different ways. In the United States, the Democratic Party is a labor-based party. And as there are questions about jobs, there are questions about Mexico is taking all our jobs. The truth is that what globalization has done all over the world and automation, jobs are disappearing or moving to other countries. This is true in what's happening in Europe and generally, and you always have to blame somebody for it in the politics of it. So it's been a complicated issue. And I have to say, when we were doing NAFTA in the first place, it was much easier for those of us in the administration to work with Republicans in order to get congressional support for the NAFTA, for the treaty itself. And I think we have to admit the politics of this in the United States. So then all of a sudden, you have the issue of TPP and all of the things that that was going to do. And it was a very carefully negotiated agreement, treaty, I can tell you. And those of us that had been out of government were brought in to talk to members of Congress about the national security aspects of TPP in terms of the number of countries that were involved in it, what it was doing to create a group of countries, 12, that had something in common, what was China's role, what was not China's role. And then all of a sudden, I have to say, even at that stage, Secretary Clinton was concerned about some of the domestic impacts of TPP. So that became a part of the campaign discussion that went on. What did happen, though, during the campaign, I have to say, is all of a sudden there was much more emphasis on who's stolen our jobs, and that NAFTA candidate Trump talked a great deal about what a terrible agreement it was, but it had to go. It was very much a part of our campaign, I think, if I may say so, in a non-productive way, but that was out there. The politics of trade is something that has been out there now. And so I believe that as President Trump is beginning to see what it's like to govern, and that he has to work with Congress, and that also, and to me this is an absolutely crucial aspect, the integration of our markets. I think you were talking about the agricultural sector, but the automotive sector and the pipelines, and where does, who makes what part of what manufactured product. I think when people have a reality check, they understand that in fact we are very integrated. Congress, the way that our Constitution is written, Article 1 is about Congress, and their biggest power comes out of the Commerce Clause. They are the ones that really have control over an awful lot of things, which is where the implementing legislation comes in. So we are going to watch, I think, from both sides of the borders, is the politics of trade, some of which is demagogic, and some of which really is something, because the people are involved. I teach a course at Georgetown, and I say foreign policy is just trying to get some country to do what you want. That's all it is. We know that. So what are the tools? And trade is one of the biggest tools out there, and it is a tool that has to be deployed in our system by the executive and the legislative branch, and it affects more people than any other of the tools. And so I think I'm very glad that the mood has changed since 24 hours ago, or at least the president said something different. And I think the question is going to be how this plays out. And it's very important to also think about Canada. I don't think Mexicans kind of thought that all of a sudden they would be interested in the lumber industry in Canada. And by the way, the most radical thing I did as Secretary of State was to move Canada into the Western Hemisphere. As far as the United States government was concerned, Canada was in Europe. And so I decided, it is in the Western Hemisphere, that it would be useful to have it in the system in the Western Hemisphere, because it's a democracy that also cares about its people and the way that it operates. So I think that the politics of all this is fascinating, and I think that it should be part of an overall discussion. And I think you're right, we have to watch. But what parts of TPP will be useful and not? To what extent are national security issues then also tied up with trade issues?
Well, if there is a will to renegotiate trades, I think we may actually come up with an improved trade. Yep. If the three countries are on that dynamics, we'll just have to wait and see, as you said. And let me suggest we go back for a few minutes to the issue of deportation and migration, because deportation is, without any question, the most immediately potentially tragic consequence of a policy that considers refugees or immigrants as a security problem. Are Mexican and Central American immigrants, legal or illegal, do they represent a security problem for the United States? Is that the main reason why there is this apparently will to reinforce, not very gently by the way, security in the border?
Well, I personally think that the immigrants and refugees from Mexico are not a security problem. I think part of what is going on in the United States now that troubles me a great deal is kind of the fear factor. Do we have to be afraid of foreigners? And frankly, the issue, a security problem, has mostly to do, even the way President Trump talks about it, has to do with people that are Muslims or coming from the Middle East. And even that, I happen to have signed on with a bunch of other high-level national security people to say that the ban coming on the Middle East was a gift to ISIS, because it gives them a great recruiting tool. I think the problem that is generally out there with migration is the U.S. is known for being a country of the rule of laws, and I think that it is better if people come into this country legally, that there's a process, that it should be fair, that people are not discriminated against, and that there be a legal system. And it does create some difficulties when there are people that have come in legally and then people that have come in illegally, how they rank with each other, which is why I said I thought there needed to be a really comprehensive new immigration legislation. I do think that one has to be humane, and that's the part that really I find just appalling in terms of what is going on and the unfairness. And the question is whether the politics of immigration, how that is going to work. And I have to say, I have spent a lot of time now looking at the whole issue of refugees generally, and the role that they have played in a number of countries, because they do take jobs of people that might go to the local people, though I don't happen to believe that either. But I think that the United States needs to be better about refugees generally, and certainly about the relationship with Mexico on this issue. I do think we have a common issue, however, or a problem that we should be dealing with, and those are the people that are coming from Central America, the unaccompanied children, and the various issues that they face, and how we deal with this together.
I totally agree with what you say. Perhaps we should link the issue of the construction of a wall with the issue of migration. And on that first matter, I would say, Madeleine, that in the case of Mexico, we resent very much the idea of building a wall between Mexico and the US. We find it, on the one hand, offensive. We find it as a hostile act against Mexico. And we find that the construction of a wall will lead us nowhere for a number of factors. One important being whether or not it will be useful. From our point of view, it will be useless because the idea that it will stop migration is not correct. There are planes, there are boats, there are many other means of transportation that will make the wall unusable for the purposes it was designed. But in addition to that, it will affect the collaboration between the two countries in the border itself. The border between Mexico and the US is one of the most intense areas of collaboration. And by that I mean labor, legal labor, by that I mean trade, by that I mean investment, by that I mean tourism. The number of crossings that we have in the border is just enormous. Probably it means 1 million persons moving every single day from one place to the other in the area of the border. So it will do damage in that respect, in the conviviality in the border area between the US and Mexico. But it may also affect the environment, because by building a wall, you will not allow a movement of other species, not human species, but otherwise, that will affect altogether the environment in the area. There is an additional issue which has to do with cost. According to the assessments made by experts, the building of a wall in that very long border will mean something like $21 billion to $25 billion, which is money that could be better applied in other sectors. By that I mean health, by that I mean education, by that I mean housing, infrastructure. And I have the feeling that Congress is not too happy with the idea of having a deficit of that amount by agreeing to provide the funds for the construction of the wall. So my main point is that the wall doesn't serve any useful purpose in political terms, in economic terms, and in the conviviality between Mexico and the US.
I think the wall is crazy. And I think that it is one of the really damaging things that have been said, and even the thought of it, I think, is very bad. And we all come from different parts of the world and different eras. And for me, I thought about the Berlin Wall, what that meant, and how it was seen as a symbol of anger and ugliness and a way of dividing people. When the wall came down, everybody celebrated. And I'm not for walls. I do think that, and the cost of it, all of that, I think is damaging and, if I may be blunt, stupid. So the bottom line here is, though, how does one deal with borders? I think that certainly is an issue. It's been an issue as Europe was trying to have open borders and what that means, and how every country does have a right to determine who goes in and out of that country. That has been the role of sovereignty and nation states since 1648. So the bottom line is that I think there is a way that together people on both sides have a right to see who's coming in and out, that people have the papers, that they have a reason to go back and forth, and tourism being one of them, And so I am for having some kind of a system that does, in fact, make it possible for both the Mexicans and the Americans to know who goes back and forth. I had to fill out some papers when I came into Mexico the day before yesterday, including my birth date. So the bottom line is that I do think that's appropriate. But I think that the wall discussion has diverted attention and has become a symbol of dislike for each other and a protective and calling people on either side terrible names, and it is going to cost somebody. And just the discussions about the wall, I think, have been very damaging. And I would be, you're talking about the deficit and the amount of money and the politics of it, but I think that there has to be a way to have a border that makes sense, that people feel comfortable, but not a wall.
One of the arguments that have been used to in favor of the wall is that it will stop drug trafficking. I certainly don't believe it will stop drug trafficking at all, but drug trafficking is an issue, and it has to be addressed together with weapons and with people traffic. So what is your perspective on drug trafficking and whether it may have or no any relationship with the wall? The issue itself needs to be addressed once again, I think.
Let me just go back to the issue of migration and the issue of deportations. In the case of Mexico, we were really concerned about massive deportations. That, up to now, has not happened, but it could happen. I mean, because the idea is being repeated on tweets that periodically we read, and we are very alarmed by that. Deportation has meant massive deportation, or the whole series of pronouncements regarding deportation have meant not only in Mexico, but in the migrant community in the US, the introduction of fear. Many, many migrants who are now in the US panic by the idea of being deported and panic by the idea of breaking the integrity of families. And that is happening because you are seeing families that become divided because the parents came into the US undocumented, but however, the children were born in the US. So the fathers and mothers are being expelled, leaving young children totally unprotected. Now, you are right. We have to find the means in a genuine effort of collaboration in order to try to solve the issue. Now, in the case of Mexico, I think that we are making an important effort in order to make use of the legal means we have before us in order to protect our nationals. And perhaps we may be successful in that respect. And by that I mean, Madeleine, resorting to the judicial system of the US. The judicial system of the US provides a number of rules that will mean the possibility that Mexicans can be legally protected. For example, the constitutional due process of law. I think that the idea, which by the way is embedded in the executive orders, that migrants are criminals, that migrants are delinquents, is not correct. And that migrants can be expelled immediately, expeditiously. I don't think that is correct. I think that the institutions of the US allow you to go before a judge and to present your case. And if you are a criminal, you may be expelled. But if you are not a criminal, there is no reason to do that. Additionally, we face a number of other problems. Unaccompanied children. It's something that is extremely sad because in many instances we have Central American children moving on their own. And by that I mean young boys and girls who are 13 years old, 14 years old, and that because of the violence that they are suffering in Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, they move to the US using the Mexican territory. But once they are in the US, they are without shelter. Because if they try to find their parents, they will not find them because the parents were left behind. So they will be very much on their own. So what I am suggesting is to resort to the judicial institutions of the US and to the US Constitution itself and to the precedents established by the Supreme Court of the US, an institution that has indicated that anyone who is in the US territory, be legally, illegally, and whatever his condition may be, gender, ethnicity, has the right to be protected by the due process of law. Okay. So we should resort to that.
Well, I would agree with that. I think, again, what there are politics in this in a number of ways. And by the way, I think President Obama, through the DREAM Act, did the right thing, but he also did some deportations, and I think people have been concerned about that. But I kind of, as an immigrant myself, I kind of put myself into the shoes of, I came to the United States when I was 11 years old. I didn't become a citizen until I was in college, a junior in college. I was 20. So the bottom line, I never was afraid that somebody would pick me up. And I think that part of the issue here is the fear factor in terms of families and all the things that you're talking about. And I am a very proud American of what kind of a country we've been. And the Statue of Liberty doesn't have fine print on the bottom that says we don't want certain numbers of people. And I think that we have to go back to our value system. But I do think this also does need the help of Mexico. And for our security people or our judicial systems to work together on this, I also think that that's why the Central American children are such a problem. And by the way, I can't speak for all immigrants, but mostly people would prefer to live in the country where they were born, if in fact they can make a living. And one of the things that's been happening is the numbers out of Mexico are going down because the economy here and various things are working. And so I do think we have to see the larger picture of it. But I think inhumanity is impossible, for me, is so disgusting and destructive. But the politics of this issue, as much as we can sit here in this beautiful place and figure out an answer, it is not what's going to happen. And I think that there are a lot of very ugly political issues from many sides. And it is up to our judicial system and the executive and legislative branches to work this out.
Very well. Important as this issue is, I'm going to ask you to move to other issues because otherwise we won't cover our agenda. So what about reviewing briefly the trafficking, the drugs?
But let me just say, this is something that has been going on for a very long time, and it is interesting because I've been on, when I was Secretary of State and I would come and argue, and the Mexicans would say, well, you guys are the ones that caused the problem. If you'd stop using drugs, there wouldn't be a market. And we say, if you'd stop selling them, there wouldn't be. So this goes back and forth. And I do think that something has to be done about the drug trade. And unfortunately, in many societies, there are criminal elements that are, you were talking about even the children, is in fact there are those who are making money by smuggling people. There are people that make money off the drug trade on both sides of the border. And again, I think this is one of these issues where we have to work together. The drug epidemics in all our countries are debilitating to our societies. But you can't say X is just because you're born somewhere that you are a criminal drug dealer. So we have criminal drug dealers on both sides, but it's a crime, and both our countries need to work on that with the others.
Indeed, you're absolutely right. Let me tell you that in the case of Mexico, we have an enormous problem as a result of transnational criminal organizations. It's perhaps, together with corruption and impunity, the main concern Mexican society has, and we expect our government to take stronger measures in order to make sure that these cartels that traffic with drugs are no longer a relevant actor in Mexican society. Unfortunately, we have not been successful up to now. Now, the reasons for that are related also to corruption and to impunity, because the fact that the cartels, the drug traffickers, deal with an enormous amount of money, which becomes very tempting to officials to, put a blind eye to the activities of these criminal organizations, is a factor that bothers us a great deal. Now, what I don't see is a sufficient collaboration on the part of our two governments. Let me give you an example. In the case of the Chapo Guzman, I'm sure you have heard of him, he was listed by Forbes as one of the richest men in the world. Now, why we just don't follow the money? I mean, if he is so bloody wealthy, it wouldn't be all that difficult to find out where those financial resources are deposited. And I don't think we have made a sufficient effort to make sure that we attack the money laundering in a sufficient manner. For those purposes, we would need a far larger collaboration between our ministries of the Treasury, our central banks, and also the private banking system, in order to make sure that we go to one of the sources of the power of organized crime.
Yes.
Bernardo, the thing that, talking about this, immigration and generally, and trade, it is very clear that both our countries are better off if we cooperate and do not see each other as the problem. That we have so many things that we have to do together. And what was interesting at a certain stage was trying to figure out how to deal with the drug issues through cooperation by our different agencies on it. And I think that on following the money, that also requires international cooperation. I think on the fear factor generally, if we could really share intelligence, that would also be helpful. And just name the issue, and it doesn't take a brain surgeon to figure out, or a psychiatrist, to figure out that we're much better off if we cooperate on these issues. And it goes back to what I said in the first place, that the number of issues that Mexico and the United States have in common that can be dealt with if we respect each other and recognize that we can do this together would make both our countries better off.
As we are starting to run a little bit short of time, let me suggest we move to a couple of additional important issues. I'm sure there are many others, and it may not be possible to cover all of them, but perhaps with the questions from the public in a few minutes, that'll give you an opportunity to either come back to some of the issues or address some new ones that we have not addressed as yet. We've talked a little bit about Central America and Guatemala and the problems that they're also facing, and how these countries are using Mexico as a route to enter the United States. But maybe it would be also interesting for the audience to talk a little bit about the role of our bilateral relationship in a broader Latin American context. Maybe you want to spend a few minutes telling us your impressions about what's going on in the relationship with Cuba, which is also a point that in Mexico is a very sensitive issue, and also your impressions about what's going on in Venezuela and Colombia, and perhaps have at least a little bit of radiography of Latin America from your perspective, Madeleine.
Well, let me say that the relationship of North America with Latin America has never been quite simple, if I can put it this way. Either the United States is accused of not paying enough attention, or we are accused of paying too much attention and interfering. So trying to figure out exactly how to do that, I think, is part of it. And again, I'm very proud to have worked for President Clinton, who was very interested in having a more respectful relationship, the Summit of the Americas. When I was secretary, I used to carry around maps that showed how authoritarian governments were being replaced by democratic governments. And the authoritarian governments were in red, and the democratic ones were in green. And on the last map, there was only one little red island left. And so there was a real pride in the kind of movement forward of relationships. And I do think that it's important for us to understand what we have in common, the Western Hemisphere, and how we operate together. I think that there do continue to be very serious issues. Venezuela at the moment, I think, is the one that is the biggest problem, as they have just pulled out or threatened to pull out of the OAS. And OAS has been, as you mentioned at the beginning, the regional organization that brought us all together, and in fact was ahead of the United Nations. Chapter 8 of the UN Charter is based on the fact that the OAS already existed, how to deal with regional organizations. So I am very worried about Venezuela and its influence in various places. Cuba, I have to say, President Clinton was prepared to normalize relations with Cuba until there was the shoot down of the unarmed civilian planes. The embargo had been an executive action until then it turned into a law, Helms-Burton, which not only affected US-Cuban relations, but also third parties that traded with Cuba. I do think that what President Obama did was the right thing in terms of changing our relationship with Cuba. And I think that there still is a lot of work that has to be done. The Cuban government has to live up to some of their aspects in terms of human rights and issues there, but I think it was a step forward. I do think the best story, however, for the whole area is Colombia. I think that I'm very proud of the fact that the Clinton administration started the process that was Plan Colombia. It was carried forward by every administration. It's a bipartisan approach. Congress supported it. And now, in many ways, Plan Colombia can be Peace Colombia. But it doesn't mean that the work is over. But that it did show, when we worked together, because other countries were involved in that we can make a difference in this hemisphere, and that this is a crucial relationship among all of us in this hemisphere. And again, it's diplomatic, it's economic, it is the people part of this, and dealing with the issues that are out there that we can work on together.
I share your view that Colombia is a success story. And it's a success story because of the virtues of diplomacy and the virtues of negotiation. In spite of the very difficult time President Santos had with his predecessor, who opposed any sort of negotiation, President Santos has been extremely successful, and we look forward to a peaceful Colombia that will develop in a proper way. In the case of Cuba, President Obama made it very clear. Sanctions have not worked. The policy the US has followed has not been successful, and we need to change that. So he made an opening, an important political opening, and up to now, we think that that's the right track and one that should be followed. And my hope is that the Trump administration will not make a regression of that. Of course, the Cubans have to take their own responsibilities in order to commit themselves to a process that will mean democratic institutions, economic development, a number of other things. That's their responsibility. But the US is very important in terms of promoting the values that are relevant for this purpose. In the case of Venezuela, I think all of us are very much concerned. Things are going very wrong, and let's hope that the collective effort of the different countries in this continent may be able to convince the authorities in Venezuela to make an opening and come back into the democratic process that it is essential to human rights, to conviviality, to the respect of individuals that are acting in the political system. Madeleine, in the case of Central America, let me tell you that something that you surely know, but that the three countries, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, are going through an extremely difficult process that perhaps has to do with the civil wars and the regional wars that took place in the 80s, and that unfortunately violence has not disappeared altogether from those three countries. But unfortunately, also the democratic system is beginning to be embedded into the political system of these countries. They face a number of difficult situations, one being the presence of transnational organized crime. In the three countries, you will find extremely powerful criminal organizations that are operating very profitably, and that has meant plenty of violence in these countries. And as a result of that, plenty of migration from people who want to escape from that area. Now, I would suggest that a program of collaboration between Canada, the US, Mexico, Colombia, perhaps some other Latin American countries, and of course the 5 Central American countries come together in order to introduce a plan of economic development, of strengthening of institutions, and of making sure that these criminal organizations disappear from the picture. If we find, for example, the possibility of making sure that migrants no longer want to migrate, but that want to stay in their own country because they have opportunities in terms of jobs, in terms of prosperity, in terms of security, then we will be successful. But it's very likely that they cannot do it all on their own, and that they will need the assistance, the political and economic assistance of our region, the countries, the governments I have mentioned, in order to make sure that we collectively help to solve the problem.
I think that it would be good to do it regionally and collectively. And before we talked about the Inter-American Development Bank, I have talked to Luis Alberto Moreno because they do want to do something, understanding that that triangle of insecurity is creating problems, and I think that it would be very interesting to work together to try to push what you are talking about.
Very well. As I am starting to review some of the questions from the audience, one last issue I would like you to address briefly, Madeleine and Bernardo, if you wish, and has to do with the role that other institutions, non-governmental institutions, can play in restoring the relationship with the United States. And I'm talking, and with other countries as well, but particularly with the United States. And I'm talking of institutions such as Aspen Institute or other organizations from society, the academia, the universities. Perhaps in a few minutes the rector can tell us what universities in Mexico are offering as their contribution in giving the relationship other perspectives that could also help and perhaps enrich the formal diplomatic state and state relationship. What role do you see on that?
I really see a big role in it. And by the way, I always try to make more interesting what I'm doing now than what I did before. Not easy if you've been Secretary of State. But the bottom line is that I think that civil society and people-to-people relationships can play a very, very large role. And also the private sector, because there's a real reason to having agreements and working together and trying to solve problems. And I obviously think that the kinds of meetings that the Aspen Institute organizes are great because they are without ideology and they are a way to exchange ideas and respect each other. But I also think that what is useful is to always have projects to work on together, and therefore I think the private sector can play a very large role in that. And universities. I feel very strongly, I have students from Mexico and lots of places as a professor, and not only do I like to hear their views, but I also know that they are creating bonds with American students that will last them their whole life. They will go through network after network and say, I remember when we did this together. And I think that's what we should focus on.
You are, again, very right. In the case of Mexico, Madeleine, in recent times, civil society has been playing an important role dealing with important issues related to public policy. For example, in terms of combating corruption, civil society has made an important contribution in order to establish a better legal system than the one we have had before. It has been also an important element in gaining respect on issues regarding violence, which is, as I said before, a matter of great concern, of issues related to organized crime. So it's a new factor in Mexico. In the case of US, you have a larger experience in terms of having an active civil society providing inputs for public policy. In our case, it's a developing process that in the future, I hope, will play a larger role. You mentioned universities. According to the news we have, Chinese students are present in American universities to a very large extent. To our regret, we don't have a similar number of students in US universities. Not only Mexico, by the way, but the whole of Latin America has not had sufficient opportunities to reach education in American universities. So as far as we can promote that idea, it will mean, as you have said, a scheme of collaboration that will last forever.
I think one additional part of this is that it's important to have a free media in our countries, that democracy depends on having journalists who feel comfortable reporting the news. We're having a small problem in the US at the moment in terms of some new phenomenon called fake news. But the bottom line is, I do think that as we look at the elements of civil society, how governments work with their people, a truly important role is the role of the press. And I think we have to understand, and you were talking about corruption, that's the way. I mean, if something is revealed by the press, I think that we need to respect our journalists.
Very well, thank you very much. We're now then entering the last part of the dialogue, and I'm going to read some of the questions that I have here. Some of them are for both of you, some of them are for one of you. And this first one comes from a deputy, a federal deputy, Georgina Gagiola, who is here in the audience, and she is concerned with gender equality. And she asked you, Madeleine, how hard was it for you to be appointed the first Secretary of State as woman?
It was a surprise, that's for sure. Let me just say the following. I think that I am also worried about gender equality generally, and I was the first Secretary of State that actually made women's issues central to American foreign policy, not just because I'm a feminist, but because more than half the population in every country is female, and unless women are politically and economically empowered, then it's hard to have stable societies. But let me just say, when my name came up to be Secretary of State, what happened was the people who didn't want me there said that a woman could never be Secretary of State because Arab leaders would not deal with a woman. And so what happened was the Arab ambassadors at the UN got together and they put out a statement. They said, we've had no problems dealing with Ambassador Albright. We would have no problems dealing with Secretary Albright. So that went away. But then somebody at the White House, and I never want to know who, said, yeah, Madeleine's on the list, but she's second tier. So that then went away. I got named as Secretary of State. I think that what is interesting is I had less problems with the men in foreign governments because I sat with a sign that said United States. I did arrive in a large plane that said United States of America. And one of my first meetings was with, in Kuwait with the Gulf Cooperation Council foreign ministers. And I said, we had a good meeting, and I said, perhaps you've noticed that I'm not dressed the same way as my predecessors, and you've been very kind, and next time we'll talk about women's rights. And we did, because they had daughters, and they wanted to know about American schools and all kinds of things. So frankly, I had more problems with the men in our own government. And not because they were male chauvinist pigs, but because they, in fact, had known me too long. I had been the carpool mother. I had had them over for dinner. I had cooked the dinner. Then I was a staffer on the Hill. I made a lot of coffee and Xeroxed a lot. And then they thought, how did she get to be Secretary of State when I should be Secretary of State? So there was a little bit of that problem. And I have to tell this story now, which is that I know that I would not have been Secretary of State if it hadn't been for Hillary Clinton. And the reason I know that is President Clinton actually said so publicly when we were, I think, in Guatemala. And what happened was that I would introduce her, she would introduce him, and he said that during this period of the great mentioning, she would come to him and say, why wouldn't you name Madeleine? She is most in tune with your views, expresses them better than anybody else, and besides, it would make your mother happy. So that's how it happened.
Very well. Bernardo, yes, you want to add something?
Just
Please.
a comment. I would strongly recommend to all of you the reading of the memoirs of Madeleine Albright. It's a superb biography, autobiography, and there she describes all that process of how she managed to become ambassador, permanent representative of the US to the United Nations, and then be appointed as Secretary of State by President Clinton. It's a fascinating story. I strongly recommend it to you.
Thank you, Bernardo. Thank you very much. Next question is from Amanda Sandoval. She's from the Canadian Embassy. And she's saying this: considering the congressional process in the US, the future of Mexican politics for next year, and the miscommunication among the three countries, how plausible is a fair and successful renegotiation of NAFTA in the short term?
Well, I do think that I am very hopeful that some of the things that have happened in the last 24 hours make it much more possible that there can be a fair discussion. But I have to say, a fair discussion doesn't mean silence. I think that there will be a lot of questions that come up. I mentioned the press. I think the press is going to want to know what is going on. I think that there will be a lot of statistics out there about who has what jobs. And I do think I am a great supporter of democracy in the United States and our capability of dealing with this. So I do hope that it will be a civilized discussion. And I do think that politics in all three countries are going to be very important, and I am very hopeful.
In my case, I would introduce an element of prudence because, for example, in the case of the US, President Trump will require the fast-track authorization from Congress. That will mean that once he sends the notification, he will have to wait 90 days before Congress allows him to start negotiations. Now, I think that the process of negotiations should be as quick as possible, but that doesn't mean that we should get, as a result of that, any sort of quick fix that will mean a treaty that has not the best quality in it. We have to be patient. We have to recognize that the negotiators will have to deal with very, very difficult matters, and that we might as well expect a longer negotiation than the one that is expected. I mean, people are saying, well, by the end of this year, we shall have a treaty. I don't think that's correct.
I think also there will be other things that get mixed up in it. The president has also proposed a new tax code, and some of this has to do with whether taxes will change. And then various other political issues. This will not be just a discussion of NAFTA or trade, so it will be complicated. But people often ask me if I'm an optimist or a pessimist. I'm an optimist who worries a lot. So I think that what we have to do is understand that there will be various aspects to it.
Very well. Let me tell you, Madeleine, that there are a number of questions that had to do with the issue of gender. But I think you've already commented on it, and perhaps if someone else has additional points to make, maybe a little later on. But
can I just say there are good movements on gender issues here in Mexico, where there are new laws that really do call for parity in elective offices. And I've been meeting with a lot of women here, and I think that there is real hope in this country.
Yes, indeed, and precisely Deputy Gagiola mentioned in her note that for the first time in Mexican history, 42% of the seats at the House of Representatives and almost 40% at the Mexican Senate are of different political parties are to be women now. So there's been some improvement also that needs to be mentioned. The next question I have is from Daniel Tovar from the State Department here in Mexico. And he says that the current U.S. administration has proposed a cut of 37% of the U.S. international affairs budget. And how is that going to affect aid in bilateral projects?
Well, I have to say that we're calling this the skinny budget, and what has happened is any administration always puts forward the first budget, and then what happens is Congress really deals with what is going to happen. I have many of us, again, former secretaries, have signed on in terms of trying to say that this is an inadequate budget and very damaging to the United States. Then, in the last few days, the former permanent representatives to the United Nations, we just sent a letter to members of Congress saying that the budget is also very damaging in terms of, I think Mexico would agree that the UN needs to have some reform, but it's very hard to argue for that if we are not funding the United Nations. So we have been very concerned about this budget, and just to tell you, the way that the U.S. budget is set up, it has functions in it, and function 050 is the defense function, and it has in it around $600 billion, and function 150 is for international affairs, and it has something like $48 billion, and to that they are even talking about having these further cuts. I think it is damaging the United States. I think that it will affect our assistance programs. I think it will affect our cultural exchange programs, our education programs, a lot of the civil society issues. And so I am very hopeful that this is just a first look by a new administration that is learning how the system works, and that the role of Congress in this will be very important, and also the role of civil society as they get in touch with their members of Congress and say, you can't do this.
Very well. Former Ambassador Eduardo Navarrete, and currently of a renegotiation of NAFTA, what model would be needed? The TPP model, or he suggests that perhaps take into consideration the recent Canadian-European Agreement for Trade and Cooperation as a better model?
Well, what I will say, must examine very closely the terms of the so-called CETA agreement between Canada and the European Union, because it means a very important development in terms of trade and investment. It's important to take notice that in the case of the European Union as a whole and the European Commission as the organ in charge of these matters, in light of the so-called Lisbon Treaty, the European Union now has full competence to deal with all issues related not only to trade but also to investment. So the result of that will be that you will no longer deal with the UK or with France or with Italy or with Spain. What will happen is that you will have to negotiate treaties with the European Union regarding trade or investment or both of them. That means an extremely important change in the terms of negotiations. For example, in the case of the US, the treaty you are negotiating with the European Union is full of complications, and I'm not certain if you will reach a conclusion in that respect. In our case, we already have a treaty, which, by the way, was negotiated by Rosario Green in 2000, which is in force, but which is being renegotiated. But we don't know how far we can go in that respect because of the difficulties we may face. But let me add something that is very important and which has to do with a chapter in the CETA treaty, which introduces a totally different system of dispute resolution between states and between investors and states. And that means the establishment of a permanent tribunal to solve disputes between the parties. For that purpose, Canada would appoint 5 arbitrators, because it would be an arbitral procedure. 5 arbitrators Canada, 5 arbitrators the European Union, and 5 arbitrators coming from other places. But that means that the ad hoc arbitral tribunals that exist now would disappear in the relationship between Canada and the European Union. and you will have a permanent tribunal. Now, probably that's an issue that should be closely examined by the negotiators dealing with NAFTA. I'm sure that in the case of Canada, they will have something to say in this respect. One additional matter, the competences that are given to governments in the case of CETA, to Canada and to all the members of the European Union, are extremely important. They are competences that will mean the right, for example, to take care of public health, to take care of environmental issues, and many others that are of great concern to citizens and to governments. So I'm pretty certain that Canada will bring to the negotiating table the issues that have been already agreed with the European Union.
I think what is interesting about that is, I said earlier that no matter what, NAFTA needed to be looked at to see how you update a treaty. And I think that there have been developments of the kinds that you've just been talking about that I think should be considered, that nothing is exactly the way it was, and I think exactly what you're talking about in terms of the whole Canadian approach. And if, in the best of all possible worlds, the negotiators could understand that there are some new elements, because the dispute resolution stuff gets very bogged down, and then turns people against the treaties. So I hope that there is a creative way of looking at this.
And talking about some environmental issues, Jose de Reyes from a law firm here in Mexico City wants to know your opinion about the water conflict between US and Mexico. He says that the 2012 water treaty ends at the end of the year, and the Obama administration wasn't able to extend it before leaving office. Do you have any comments?
Well, I do think it's obviously a very important part of the story, and a lot of things have been learned about water and rivers and a variety of ways that I think that also has to be updated and looked at. But one of the big issues internationally these days is water. That if people think that oil is an issue, water is much more complicated in many ways. And so I think as part of these way of looking at our relationship, I hope that there is a creative way of looking at the water issue.
Miguel Ángel Flores, who is from the School of Political Science at UNAM, asks both of you, what do you think about Mexican president attempts of dialogue with President Trump? The attempts that Mexican president has made to dialogue with President Trump.
Well, I assume that it's a dialogue between two heads of state, and the question is, what are the prospects of negotiating with the Trump administration on the different issues?
I presume so, yes.
That are relevant to our relationship. I think that things are evolving in the right direction. I feel confident that as a result of the very clear position taken by the Mexican administration, by the president himself, by the Secretary of Foreign Relations, again, negotiations and diplomacy will be the leading factor in reaching understandings between the two countries. Now, negotiations and diplomacy are always full of obstacles, and one has to accept that. It's a process of convincing the other party that it is for the better interest of the two parties to reach an agreement, to reach an understanding that will be reciprocally useful, positive, valuable. And I think we are in that process. I cannot ignore, of course, that the many pronouncements and the many tweets we read frequently mean an important complication. Now, what I will say is that in this business of diplomacy, what you need is certainty, you need predictability, and you cannot allow any sort of surprises. You should not be a victim of a surprise at any point in time. So on the basis of these three elements, I think that the process will reach a satisfactory end for the interests of all parties concerned. I think that in due course, it will be realized that there is a commonality of interests, common interests that have to be preserved, common values that have to be preserved, and that the best way to come to a good solution is to sit down in the negotiating table and come into an agreement.
Please.
Well, yesterday's phone call seems to have been good. And I do think that it's important to have dialogue. The other part, though, that I think is important is to realize that not all dialogue needs to take place at the presidential level, that it is important to have other channels of communication that work. And I have to say it's a little complicated in the United States at the moment because not everybody has been appointed everywhere. But I do think that daily presidential conversations, it doesn't matter with what country. I can just tell you as Secretary of State, one dreads to find out what has happened at presidential level that has not gone through any system, and it happens in every administration. But I do think that dialogue is very important, and I hope very much that the kind of more normal diplomatic negotiations begin to take place between ministers. And the reason that the binational approach worked very well is that it isn't just between foreign ministers, but also the other, you were talking about health, or issues to do with tourism, or a number of different aspects that have to be dealt with at ministerial level.
Let me just add something that is very relevant, because I think Madeleine and myself have the same experience, that of the Binational Commission. It was established at in the early 80s, I would say, but that meant that every year we would have that bilateral commission, be it in Mexico City, be it in Washington, but with a composition that was extremely important, having all the important secretaries of state participating. By that I mean trade, by that I mean tourism, by that I mean infrastructure, everything. All the Attorney General, all of them getting together for 2-3 days of conversations in the two different capitals.
Yes.
Now, that meant an extremely important input to solve problems. But that binational commission has not been working in recent times. And I would say that both governments should promote the idea of reconstructing the bilateral commission and making sure that it functions, and that it functions very well.
Yes, indeed. I think it's a very good point, and a good point also to approaching the end of this conversation. I also remember, Madeleine remembers very well, with President Cedillo and President Clinton, the so-called high-level group that we met yearly. I was at that time Secretary of Health, and we met once in Washington, and the next year in Mexico City, and then in some other places. Well, before we close, I would like to ask Rector Graue, he would be kind enough to make some final comments that he might wish, and I'll take this opportunity to thank you, Madeleine and Bernardo, because you made my job very, very simple. You need no moderator whatsoever, but it was fantastic to have an opportunity to interact with you. And Rector Graue, would you please be kind enough to close the session?
I just want to make some comments on education, Margaret. And would you mind, Madeleine, to use your earphones so I can do it in Spanish? Muchas gracias, Madeleine. A ver, yo como ella soy optimista en relación a la educación y la ciencia. Yo creo que el muro de la educación y en la ciencia va a ser muy difícil de construir por las propias características de la educación y de la ciencia. Tenemos, y los datos no los tengo ahorita con precisión, pero un par de decenas de miles de estudiantes trabajando algún tipo de grado en los Estados Unidos. 3,000 de ellos corresponden anualmente a mi universidad. Y esto se ha mantenido en forma fluida y vigente. Sí nos preocupa porque si somos optimistas, también como Miss Albright, tenemos nuestras preocupaciones. Nos preocupan los dreamers. Al momento, la orden de acción en Dreamer DACA no ha sido alterado en forma importante. Pero hay alrededor de 800,000 jóvenes en estas condiciones. Se estima que 60% de ellos son mexicanos. Hasta este momento solamente 3 Dreamers han sido detenidos y 1 solo deportado. Entonces, pero vamos, yo creo que esto ha sido en buena medida por la respuesta de la ciencia y de la educación a las actitudes xenofóbicas que eventualmente se plantearon. Yo debo decir que la ciencia va a ser muy difícil que se detenga también. Revisamos hace un par de semanas con la presidenta Janet Napolitano aquellos artículos que se han publicado entre académicos de la universidad y del sistema de la Universidad de California. Y eran al menos 200 artículos en los últimos 2 años. Si las redes de ciencia siguen vigentes y están presentes, y va a ser muy difícil detenerlas. El día de ayer recibimos en la universidad al doctor McPherson, presidente de la Asociación Pública de Universidades estadounidenses, por sus siglas en inglés, Association of Public Land Grant Universities, que incluye a todas las universidades de los Estados Unidos y que fue muy solidario con México en este proceso. Y de hecho, combinamos en que un buen resultado de esta reunión será hacer nuestro tratado de libre ciencia entre Canadá, nuestro propio TLC de la educación y la ciencia entre Canadá, Estados Unidos y México. Yo creo que por ahí hay que caminar. El compartir conocimientos y el educar indudablemente será el futuro de la mejor relación bilateral. Muchas gracias, señor doctor de la Fuente, y le paso el micrófono para el closing remarks.
Muchas gracias por su asistencia, muchas gracias a la ex canciller Bernardo Sepúlveda, muchas gracias a la secretaria Madeleine Albright. Creo que ha sido un diálogo muy fructífero. Gracias a la Ciudad de México, gracias al Aspen Institute. Buenas tardes a todos.